Reform need the momentum. They thrive on momentum. It's a plague on current political parties. They're not being tested on policies. They're being tested on messages. My estimate is that about half the seats the Conservatives are defending, they will lose. There are very large numbers of people who actually thoroughly dislike Nigel Farage.
Hello and welcome to an election special episode of the Division Bell. Apologies if you hear Big Ben bonging at any point. We're filming this in the heart of Parliament. We're going to be speaking to a very special guest, Lord Hayward, one of the country's most preeminent election experts. We're going to be focusing on some key battleground states and talking about what is at stake for all the main parties. My name's Christian Calgie.
I'm Lizzy Buchan.
And this is the Division Bell.
So here we are in Parliament. It's local election day. Voters are going to the polls across England, and we're going to break down for you in numbers what this is all about. So today we've got 1,641 council seats up for grabs across 23 councils.
60% of those seats are being defended by the Tories, and they're facing rather large losses.
We've got one by-election, the first of this Parliament, in Labour-held Runcorn and Helsby, which was triggered by the resignation of former Labour MP Mike Amesbury after he punched a constituent.
We've got 6 region-wide mayoralties. Particular focus are Hull and East Yorkshire and Lincolnshire.
And we've got one former Love Island contestant running. Ollie Williams is standing to be a councillor in Cornwall for Reform.
Similarly, 30 years old, that's the age of Reform's candidate for Doncaster Mayor, Alexander Jones. He's also a former model as well as an estate agent.
So as people head to the polls today in contests across England, we're going to drill into 3 specific races, the Runcorn and Helsby by-election, the mayoral race in Lincolnshire and the council elections in Doncaster.
And to speak to us about those 3 key contests, we're now joined by Lord Hayward. Well, we're now welcoming Lord Hayward, who is a Conservative peer and amongst many other jobs and an illustrious career, is now one of the country's foremost election experts, national psephologist. So we thought we'd start by asking a very broad, zoomed out question of what is the significance of these set of local elections?
They're the most important elections for all the political parties. They're not a large amount of elections because they're only in England. There's none of the big conurbations involved, but it will set the mood for the next year until we have another set of elections. But Reform need the momentum. They thrive on momentum. The question mark as to what's happening with the Tory party. They could generate all sorts of responses from the Labour Party. I think the person most likely to be damaged, influenced by it is Rachel Reeves within the Labour Party. And it looks as if the Lib Dems and Greens will also get some momentum. So it's important for all the political parties, but in slightly different ways.
Can you remember the last time that we had an election of this size where all 5 parties were performing relatively so strongly?
No, we are now in a multi-party system and everybody has to adapt to that. One has to remember that we're talking about 5 parties in England. In Scotland, that means that there are 6 or 7 parties, yes. And in Wales, there are 6 parties at least. And that is something new for not only commentators and analysts like myself, but also for the political parties. And they have to respond in a very different way. One has to remember what seats are being fought here, first of all, because that puts in context the results that we're going to see. The last round of these elections was in 2021. Boris Johnson was at his absolute height. It was vaccine bounce. People rewarded the Conservative Party because we were the first place to go into general vaccinations against COVID. And therefore, there is no equivalent comparison going over years where any political party has done as well as the Conservatives did in 2021. So they have a very long way to fall. And in falling, there is no doubt that the biggest single beneficiaries will be Reform, who effectively start from zero because they weren't around in 2021. They've got the odd defector, but beyond that, any seats they win are almost automatically gains.
And so that obviously means that in the early hours of the morning, a lot of the story is going to be about Reform, isn't it?
What we're likely to see first is the Runcorn by-election and the mayoral elections, because you've got county council elections for seats, but you've got 6 mayoral elections, and in most cases the returning officers have decided to count those first. So we will see whether Reform is performing well in terms of the by-elections and the mayoral contests, and in most cases that is set against the Labour Party. So if Reform do well, the first headlines are going to be Labour do badly. That won't necessarily be the story 24 hours on when the results come from most of the county councils and the Tories will have lost literally hundreds of seats. But initially, if Reform do well, Labour do badly. Equally, if Labour do well, Reform are not performing as expected. The reason they're doing well is nobody can point to the record they've got. It's a plague on current political parties. The Conservatives lost the last election because everybody wanted rid of them, or most people wanted rid of them. The Labour Party have, since the general election, proved to be the most unpopular incoming government after a general election ever, not only in this country, but virtually anywhere in the democratic world. So the reason we are facing multi-party politics is because so many people have ditched the Conservatives and the Labour Party now that people are looking at all the options, and Reform is the first one, but not the only one. And it is because they just don't have a record. So they can say, we're here, we're new. They're not being tested on policies. They're being tested on messages.
And I can hear our viewers and our listeners who are of a different political affiliation screaming out here, because of course we've also got the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, both of them respectively polling very well. In fact, what's not gone spoken about is in some polls the Lib Dems are approaching 16-17% in the polls and are going to benefit very greatly. So I was wondering, I believe you've got some national picture predictions or modelling to suggest where you think the lay of the land will be when all the votes are counted. So I wondered if you might tell us those.
There are 2 halves, at least, to that answer, that question, and in terms of the answer. The first one is, because we're in multi-party politics, people are going to win with very small shares of the vote. We'll see many people winning with 25 to 30% of the overall vote, previously unheard of. My estimate is A, that the Tories are going to suffer because they were so high, and B, because they're doing badly post the general election. My estimate is that about half the seats the Conservatives are defending, they will lose, which means they will lose roughly 450, 500 seats in total. The Labour Party, who were in an appalling position in 2021, managed only to win 300 of the seats out of the 1,700 odd that were fought then, should be going back up, even though they're government and people vote against the government in local elections. But all the prospects are that they are actually going to lose seats as well. Even if they stay static, they'll have had a bad night. But one must not miss out on the Lib Dems and the Greens, starting from different levels. The Lib Dems target, having done so successfully in terms of seats at the general election, what they now want to do is mop up the council seats that are in the parliamentary constituencies that they won. So they will aim to gain 100 plus seats from the 200 that they're on roughly. Greens start from a very, very low level in terms of seats. I think they will roughly double the number of seats. But if anybody is likely to be able to cry foul in terms of a first past the post system, I think it could well be Greens, because they will have upped their overall vote quite markedly, but they won't come anywhere near getting the seats at their percentage. My expectation is that Reform will go up a few percentage points and they will get loads more seats than UKIP did just over a decade ago.
Obviously, Nigel Farage is spending quite a lot of time talking about how he's definitely going to be Prime Minister at the next election. But do you think that actually Reform might have a ceiling like UKIP did?
All the polling evidence is that there is a ceiling for Reform. As you say, UKIP stroke Brexit, what one might describe as the Farageist parties of before, have indicated that there is a ceiling. And polls show that you either like Nigel Farage, and no party in this country other than the Boris Johnson-led Conservative Party has been as populist as Reform is now with one leader. But there are very large numbers of people who actually thoroughly dislike Nigel Farage. And although this set of elections will not set the course for a general election, because that's several years away, but when we do reach that point, my expectation is that there will be a large amount of tactical voting if Nigel Farage and Reform are still around in their strengths, as they are now, because people will be determined to vote against Nigel Farage in a way that we've never seen in British politics before. People generally, with certain exceptions, don't vote tactically in this country. But there would be no doubt about the position if Reform were going into a general election with real strength.
So to what extent do you think weather is going to be the difference between a fantastic night for Nigel Farage and potentially coming slightly short on where he could have got to?
It sounds rather odd to be starting providing explanations for party leaders as to why they didn't do well. But there is no doubt that the weather is a factor. But also one has to remember that we're looking to May the 1st as the polling day. In local elections, about half of all the votes that are cast are actually cast by post and have therefore already been cast over the last fortnight. And therefore, issues that got attention yesterday in relation to, for example, Tony Blair or potential NHS strikes, won't influence half the votes that are cast, that are counted, because they've already been cast and have been over the last 2 weeks.
So one of the absolutely key results overnight is going to be the by-election in Runcorn and Helsby, which is being held to replace Mike Amesbury, the former Labour MP, who
had an eventful night out.
Who stepped down after being convicted for assaulting a constituent in a late night brawl. Obviously, Runcorn he won that seat at the general election with something like 53% of the vote. So it is, and has been for a long time, a Labour stronghold. Yeah. But Reform are trying very hard to challenge here. This is a very interesting contest, isn't it? And I think probably could have quite a big fallout depending on who wins.
The interesting thing about Reform was that initially, post the general election or in the run-up to the general election, all the concentration was on Reform vis-à-vis Conservatives. Over the last few months, what you've seen is a movement of attention towards not only Reform versus the Conservatives, but also Reform versus Labour. And there is no doubt now that much of the attention is on Reform versus Labour. And Runcorn is a classic Labour constituency, as you said. It's also in Merseyside, on the edge of Merseyside, where UKIP Brexit never did very well. And the very fact that we're sitting here discussing the prospect of Reform and Labour being neck and neck is really striking, Because a few months ago, everybody was talking about Essex and Kent and Suffolk and these sorts of places as being the areas of Reform's strength. And we're now looking at Merseyside, which was an area of Reform relative weakness. But they've won council by-elections off the Labour Party in that part of the country. And there's no question it's going to be a close call between Reform and Labour in terms of the result.
There is big concern in the Labour Party in Downing Street about that result. I mean, MPs, every MP I've spoken to in the last couple of weeks has been to Runcorn. They're all sort of
apart from Sir Keir Starmer.
Apart from Keir Starmer, yeah.
There's no question that those two parties have done, as you say, thrown the kitchen sink at it. It's illogical to send MPs, and you're right, my understanding is every Labour MP was told they had to go to Runcorn once during the Easter recess. And if I was a county council Labour candidate in Kent or Cornwall, I'd be furious about that, because your local Labour MP has been told to spend a day going up there and coming back to campaign for an hour or two in Runcorn, when they could have been campaigning in Kent or wherever it may happen to be for 6 or 7 hours on behalf of a Labour candidate. And that's an indication of how worried the Labour Party have been about it. There'll be plenty of statistics which will prove everybody's arguments right. And one of the great things about local elections in particular is that all political parties find results in places you've never heard of, to say this proves our point, we did well here or whatever. And there's no question that the numbers will be argued over in some form or another. I shall probably be party to it. I shall move from being the independent analyst to advising the Conservative Party, and I may compose some of the arguments for the Tory party.
Well, let's test you out on that one now then, because the second case study that I thought was very interesting is the Lincolnshire mayor. This is obviously, I mean, Lincolnshire, one of the most Tory areas, also one of the most Brexit areas, and there's a strong showing here from a former Conservative MP, Andrea Jenkins. How do you think that's going to go, and will that be a disaster for the Conservative Party if they lose the mayoralty?
There's no question that after Runcorn, probably the next most concentrated on result will be Lincolnshire, because both it's a Conservative bastion, and I'll qualify that in a second, and secondly, because it's a former MP, Conservative MP, who is fighting for reform. It's not actually as strong Conservative as one might imagine, because the Conservatives always win the seats in most of the seats in Lincolnshire, with some notable exceptions. But the opposition has always been split in so many different directions that actually there's a pretty large anti-Conservative vote within the county. The other factor which I think will affect results and may harm reform, probably not enough to cost them the mayoralty, but Scunthorpe and the steelworks is in that county. And I think the general perception is that the government and Keir Starmer has handled the saving of Scunthorpe very well. My guess is that many of the people in and around Scunthorpe would have been voting reform almost en bloc. But I just wonder, and I've not been there and I've not spoken to anybody but looking at it from outside, it seems as if people may well go back to voting Labour, which they've always done. It's one of the things that gets politicians a bad name in terms of leaping on a bandwagon in one form or another. But people do judge how a government handles their issues. And there's no question that we've all seen it on the media, people talking about saving their town. That's how important it actually is to Scunthorpe. And therefore, I think government either benefits or loses from decisions that are taken in those sorts of circumstances. And in this case, I think they've benefited.
we thought we'd talk about the Doncaster Council because, again, I mean, it's slightly different scenario to what we've got in the Runcorn by-election, two different forms of elections, but also without that slight Merseyside surprise. Obviously, UKIP were doing quite well in Doncaster, I remember, in the 2015 election, and you've got the Miliband factor.
Doncaster is very interesting because it's the one metropolitan borough across the whole of England that is actually going to vote. And there's no Birminghams, no Sheffields, no Leeds. It is historically a Labour bastion with a very strong white working class vote. And the indications are that Labour are in trouble at both the mayoralty level in Doncaster and at council level. And it's in trouble to reform. And if Labour lose Runcorn and Doncaster, mayoralty or council, that will be two of the three entities that you will be judging Labour for in terms of have they done well or badly. And it's something that initially, when I did my original estimates, I thought that Labour would lose council seats in Doncaster and Durham. They're two bastions which they have. I now think they're going to lose more seats than I had considered 2 or 3 weeks ago, because all the opinion poll measurements in terms of the estimation of individuals, whether it's Keir Starmer or Rachel Reeves, or criticisms of the government, disillusionment, they have been moving downwards more negatively. The consumer, the confidence of business and consumers are going downwards. And I understand that Labour are having a very bad time, and therefore it's reasonable to look at Doncaster in a way that I probably wouldn't have done even a month ago.
And then finally, if we just go back to the Liberal Democrats and the Greens, those home counties, those nice leafy areas in the southwest, rather, tell us about how that may play out.
It's a very different election from the ones in the north and the North Midlands. It's Conservatives against Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats did remarkably well across that whole belt of the home counties down to Devon at the general election, and the Liberal Democrats have been concentrating on mopping up the council seats which they don't currently hold in the parliamentary constituencies which they now hold. They want hegemony over any particular area within any of the counties in terms of the south and the southwest. And there are very good prospects for the Lib Dems and to a lesser extent for the Greens in that belt.
And obviously these elections are about local services, but they're also about the wider picture. I mean, do you think that this is a referendum on both Nigel Farage and Keir Starmer?
It's not a referendum as such on national politics and national politicians, but there is no question that at the end of the day, adding up the numbers of votes, adding up the numbers of seats, looking at the key locations that have gone in one way or the other, that the results will be judged as a referendum on Kemi Badenoch, Nigel Farage, Keir Starmer, or whoever it may happen to be. You make the transformation from results to analysis to impact. And it's the impact on individuals that will set the tone in this building for the next few months.
You mentioned earlier that there could be consequences for somebody like Rachel Reeves from these results.
There will be a real problem for Rachel Reeves in particular, because what MPs in Labour, and there are quite a few Labour MPs in farming communities, what Labour MPs in farming communities will want is very different from those which are Labour MPs in South Yorkshire and West Yorkshire and Nottinghamshire, and those who represent the big academic and public sector communities of any of the great university cities.
And lastly, what is the best case scenario for the Conservatives?
The best case is that they win Cambridgeshire. that they retain around just a bit more than half the county council seats, that they do not allow the Liberal Democrats to have every single county council seats in the vast majority of Lib Dem held seats, and that they actually will probably do pretty well in the overall vote, because the Lib Dems will be concentrated in one place, Labour will be concentrated in another, Reform may well be very well spread, and therefore that the Conservatives can turn around and say, well, look at the total votes we got, even though we've lost lots of seats.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks for joining us for another episode of The Division Bell. Please follow us on socials @Mirror Politics and @_Daily Express. Bye for now.
See you next time.